I thought it might be useful to go back and revisit some of the key concepts that we've discussed up to this point in class to help tie them together, to show the underlying progression of ideas, and to give you some ideas for the political context paper. I decided to do this after reading people's reaction papers this week because people are doing a really good job overall, but I also feel like there's some connections that are not necessarily being made. So before I get into those connections, one thing I want to emphasize again is it's very important to make sure that you read all of the assigned work, not just the ones that are directly tied to a written assignment. Part of the disparity in the quality of assignments is very much due to whether or not people are engaging all the material. A lot of the material is intended to help clarify or go deeper into the concepts that are relevant for the assignment. So please just try to keep that in mind as you move forward. So the first connection I wanted to make was between Du Bois and the indigenous education and desegregation. One of the key takeaway concepts there is self-determination, the connection between having control over what you learn, how you learn, and the quality of what you're learning, and your relationship to the broader political, economic, and social context. So Du Bois is basically saying knowledge is political, that it is human constructed, and that how you construct knowledge and how you impose knowledge on other people has power. And that for African Americans, especially in that time period, being able to have the authority to control knowledge, to construct knowledge, and to validate knowledge is a fundamental aspect of human rights and their ability to obtain civil rights in the United States. The reason why, and you can see this in the Precious Knowledge video in a contemporary setting, but the reason why is because people are located differently depending on all these different identity factors, economic factors, political factors. So being of a certain economic status or a particular racial identity or citizenship status or gender, all of that locates you in relation to broader society in a particular way. So if you're not able to analyze your experiences and analyze the struggles or the problems that face you from that particular position, your hands are tied in many ways in the ability to effectively address those problems and solve them on your own. So if you start from an assumption that, many school curricula do, that there's some sort of universal norm or a kind of default position that all students occupy, that becomes very problematic because basically what you're doing is you're only providing a small segment of the population with knowledge of themselves, with effective tools to address their own lives. And in many ways, you're not only disenfranchising other students from the ability to do that, you're actually actively repressing them. You're actively participating in their marginalization because you're denying them in an active way the tools, the knowledge, and the values that they would need in order to be fully realized human beings. So that's where that dangerous and safe diversity come into play. This recognition that there's a relationship between the kind of knowledge you can access and the meaning that you will make from it, the behaviors that you will employ in your life, the relationships that you will have, and the agency or the power that you will have to decide for yourself, to govern yourself. So with Indigenous people, it's a bit different than African Americans at this time period because Indigenous people are members of tribal nations. They're sovereign nations. So they have a very unique political status that is different than any other racially marginalized group. So first we have to understand the incredible heterogeneity or diversity within tribal nations to understand why that is relevant. Because one thing we can recognize from that is it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. So just from that standpoint, dangerous diversity is very significant. We can even see today that a lot of times there is this homogenizing impulse towards tribal nations. If you look at the typical representation of Native American. It's usually a feather headdress, a teepee, a tomahawk, buckskin, like those kind of things. Those are very specific aspects of Plains Indians, usually the Lakota peoples, but that's not a representation that is culturally accurate or relevant for the vast majority of indigenous peoples, not only in North America but around the world. But it's that dominant image that kind of trumps the diversity that exists in reality. So there's that initial struggle just to get recognized as heterogeneity, as heterogeneous. So for example, in Wisconsin, we have 11 federally recognized tribal nations just in Wisconsin. And there's a great amount of diversity even in our state that may not be recognized. And what that means in practical terms is that you have to know the specific history, the specific customs, traditions, ways of seeing the world that are connected to that community in particular. It doesn't transfer necessarily. So the way that you understand Oneida history, for example, is very different than how you would engage Ojibwe nations. And even there, how you would engage the Lakota Ojibwe community would be different than how you would engage Bad River or Red Cliff or maybe even White Earth in Minnesota. That would all be different. That doesn't mean there's not relationships, but there's also a strong specificity. And under an indigenous knowledge system, that's appropriate and even desirable. That's what Loma Wima and McCarty referred to as dangerous diversity, where the tribal nations are not necessarily looking to homogenize or become more like each other. What they're looking for is the respect of each other's independence and the ability to relate to one another as equals across those differences and still have a strong relationship where you are deeply connected. So they don't see a difference, in other words, as a barrier to a close relationship. And that's very different than what's going on in broader U.S. society at this time. In broader U.S. society, if you remember from that As American as Public School video, we can see that tremendous fear of difference, that huge impulse to Americanize and homogenize as much as possible. So from that standpoint, only one language is desirable, English. We don't want other languages. Only one religion, only one, cultural practice, all of that. So that's fundamentally opposed to what Du Bois is talking about and to what many tribal nations are talking about at that time. And one of the things that they see is that it's not just we like eating food this way and we want to keep it. It's that there's a deeper meaning behind that behavior. That's what they're protecting. So when you separate the behavior from the meaning behind it, it becomes safe diversity. When you take a craft that usually you would do in the community with older women, and through the making of that craft, you're engaging in a relationship with those older women, you're talking to them, and they're teaching you, that becomes meaningful because of the relationship and because of the knowledge that you are engaging as part of that process. So if you take that craft and separate it from that process and just move it in school where you just do it as a project, it's a completely different meaning. It means something completely different. And that's what Collier was looking to do. He was looking to separate the meaning from the behavior and replace his own desired meaning instead, so that indigenous people would think differently. So for example, if you are still maintaining your language, but you're using it to read the Bible, that means something completely different than using your language to maintain traditional spiritual practices that are thousands of years old, that are the heart of maintaining your relationship to other people in the community, your relationship to the world around you, your relationship to the Creator. If you take that out and replace it with a different set of relationships, a hierarchical relationship to a Christian God, to a minister or a priest, and then to individuals in the community, that's completely different. So we have to understand that it's not just a matter of I prefer dancing this way or wearing this outfit or doing this craft. It's a much deeper idea. And so this is where we get into what is second-class integration and what constitutes equal participation, equal rights in schooling. So if we understand that idea that there are certain meanings and relationships and the ability to self-govern that's tied to knowledge, that's basically what we need to understand is being fought over in desegregation. It's not just, can I sit next to a white student and socially interact? What people are fighting for, we have to go back all the way to Du Bois and Lum Wyman McCarty for this. They're fighting for self-determination, the right to self-govern, and the right to have their own knowledge systems, their own meaning-making inside the school. In other words, knowledge and meaning that will not disempower them, but that will actually be relevant and useful in living life from the way that they are positioned or located in U.S. society. So for desegregation, there's a lot of different stakes that are on the table. At a basic level, Anderson talks about having legal protection for your citizenship, which obviously is very important. But then the next step is, do we have equal resources? Do we have equal ability to develop and be present in the curriculum? Is a knowledge system in place that will not denigrate us or marginalize us or insult us or tell us that we are inferior in some way? Is that in place? Are there teachers, are there administrators, are there adults in the building who actually care about my child as a full human being and will push them to their highest potential, recognizing that they need a certain set of skills to navigate a racist society that they will be fighting against pretty much for their whole life? Is that in place? And if it's not, then what do I do about that? So in many ways, that is the ideological struggle that's happening here. We'll talk about that more in week 3, but I'm hoping that this helps a bit in clarifying some of the ideas from this week.